Welcome back to Causes and Consequences of Inequality workshop. Now we are going to have a keynote lecture. The title of the talk is Fairness Across the World, Preferences and Beliefs. It is delivered by Professor Alexander W. Cappelen, who is a professor at Department of Economics, Norwegian School of Economics. He is also Deputy Director at the Center for Excellence, FAIR, and also co-director at the Choice Lab and chairman of Center for Ethics and Economics. His research interests span from behavioral experimental economics to political philosophy, distributive justice, and let us have a lecture now. Please.
Thanks a lot. Perfect. Thanks a lot, and thanks for the invitation to present. This is really a topic that's close to my heart, the causes and consequences of inequality. And I'm super happy to present the early results from a very large project that I've done together with Ingvild Almås, Erik Sørensen, and Bertil Tongaden, all at this center in Bergen, Norway, that I encourage all of you to visit when the COVID-19 is over. It's a place we created to have a lot of visitors and a lot of activities, and we have been suffering as everyone during the COVID. So the backdrop for this project, and I'll give the details very soon, but the backdrop is two stylized facts, you might say. One is the very large differences in inequality in disposable income across the world. So this map shows the Gini coefficient in different countries, actually the countries that we're going to include in our study. And it varies from Norway, for example, which has a Gini coefficient close to 0.35, and up to countries like South Africa with a Gini coefficient above 0.6, right? So it's enormous variation. And there is also some systematic variation. And importantly, very rich countries with a high GDP per capita, they tend to have less inequality than poorer countries. And of course, this is a big topic. Why? What we're going to look at is to what extent these differences in inequality in different countries, to what extent they reflect that people simply think differently about fairness and efficiency, or maybe to put it with a little bit big words, how does these differences relate to the will of the people? And that's essentially what we're going to look at. There is another even more fundamental question here, and that is what is shaping people's views at the more fundamental level, and to understand how fairness views, efficiency preferences, and beliefs co-evolve with social institutions. Actually, we believe that our data can say something about that, but that's not going to be the focus of this presentation. Why do we want to focus on, why do we believe that fairness views might be important? Well, if you ask people, as we have done in, for example, Norway and the US, if, for example, if their fairness views are important for their voting behavior, the vast majority would say it's very important, or at least moderately important. Clearly, the role of fairness views of people may differ and will differ across societies, importantly because of different political structures, limited state capacity, and a lot of other factors. And also, fairness views of people may shape inequality through non-multi mechanisms, for example, through the way we organize the labor market and wage negotiations. So, but the general idea here is that it potentially could be an important impact of fairness views and beliefs on attitudes and willingness to accept inequality. And what type of arguments would be important to understand? If what type of justification do people give if they want to justify inequality? And in some sense, there are two stories here. One is the classical story that we economists typically have talked about, and that's the equality efficiency trade-off story. What's that story? Well, it's a story that essentially we dislike inequality, but we might have to accept some inequality to achieve efficiency. So that's the one trade-off. We don't like it in some sense. We think it's unfair, but we need it for efficiency reasons. The other story, another justification, is that, well, some inequality is simply fair. People who worked harder or more talented, they deserve more. That's a very different type of story. Or to put it slightly more precisely, people might then differ in their preferences in terms of the trade-off between equality and efficiency, and they might differ in what they consider fair inequalities. And then they might differ in their beliefs. So this what I said now was their preferences. But given these preferences, clearly your beliefs about how equality affects efficiency is going to be important. And your beliefs about the causes of inequality is going to be important, again, for your inequality acceptance. And that's essentially what we're looking at in this study. In the approach we take in the project Fairness Across the World, we measure preferences, and I'll give you much more detail very soon, but essentially we study real distributive behavior of representative populations in 60 countries who are put in identical economic environments where we control and randomly vary the source of inequality and the cost of redistribution. So in that way, we elicit essentially people's fairness views and their preferences for the equity efficiency trade-off. And then we study beliefs about the equality efficiency trade-off and a broad range of beliefs about whether individual choices and background factors may cause inequality. And finally, we measure we relate these preferences or beliefs to whether people find existing inequalities unfair and the extent to which they support redistribution. And then, of course, on top of all this, so this is the data that we have collected. We have very rich data both at the individual level and, of course, at the country level that we can relate to these preferences, beliefs, and attitudes. Just overview. What do we believe this study contributes? Well, we provide a unique study of fairness preferences across the world. As far as we know, this is the largest experimental study implemented in the social sciences. It is, as I said, it's going to be more than 66,000 individuals making decisions for 66,000 pairs of workers, real decisions. Provide the first global study that jointly measures fairness preferences, beliefs about the source of inequality and the efficiency cost, and policy preferences. It provides novel insights on how fairness preferences and beliefs vary within and between countries. And we believe this contributes to explaining global variation in inequality. And we provide global large-scale causal evidence on the importance of the source of inequality and the importance of the cost of redistribution for inequality acceptance in the general population. So that's the contribution. Quickly on the way forward here, I'm going to present the study design. Try to be quick, but I'm sure there might be, if there are some clarifying questions, I'm happy to take them along the way. Otherwise, I'll try to finish so we have some minutes at the end. And then I'll present the results for each part of this study. And then before moving to the within country and between country variations. Okay, so, and I'll spend a little bit time on this so that you get the gist of the design. We collaborated with Gallup Roll Poll in 2018. Gallup Roll Poll, for those who don't know, it's essentially it's the gold standard of doing international survey research. We implemented this module in 60 countries with 65,800 respondents, at least 1,000 in each country. Our module consisted of 3 parts. We had a module on fairness preferences, where all respondents made a real spectator decision for 2 workers, we had a belief part where all respondents answered a subset of questions on their beliefs about the causes of inequality and the belief about the efficiency cost of redistribution. And then we had 2 questions about attitudes to current inequality and whether or not government should aim to reduce inequality. This is a novel approach. I think this for the Gallup World Poll. Other economists have used the Gallup World Poll, but only for survey studies. So we are the first to actually implement an incentivized experimental study using this platform. These are the countries that were included. Here is the list. Essentially, we have included all large countries and some small ones. They covers 80% of the world's population. Okay, so how do we elicit fairness preferences? So what we use is something we call spectator design. So we have people who make real decisions for someone else. So spectators, that we call them, decide whether or not to redistribute earnings between a pair of workers who have conducted a job. The workers are recruited through an international online labor market. It's the same pool used in all countries. What we are really interested in is the spectator decision. So I'm not going to talk about the workers at all. They were there just to make the decisions real. So we actually paid all these workers in line with what we told the spectators. The spectators, they were recruited and participated through the Gallup World Poll. As I said, they constitute representative samples of populations in the 60 countries. And they were randomized into 3 treatments. It's a between individual design. It's a luck treatment, a merit treatment, and an efficiency treatment that introduces a cost of redistribution. And I'll explain the details of the design. So the basic setup, if you use this in the American context, we adjusted the amounts for in each country. But in the US, essentially what we told them was that 2 workers had worked. They'd done the same task, but at the end, we surprised them by telling them there was going to be a bonus, and we randomly drew 1 worker who got earned a bonus of $6. The other worker didn't earn anything. The decision of the spectator is whether or not he or she wants to redistribute between these 2 individuals. So this is in the luck treatment. So essentially we have created an inequality that is due to luck. And the spectator has the possibility to do something about that. And we ask them whether or not they want to do it. And in this case, there is no cost of redistribution. And as I said, the source of inequality is luck. So that's the, think of it as the base treatment. They could then, as I said, the 3 alternatives, leave it that is, in which case the one who was lucky gets 6, the other gets 0, or they could redistribute either $1.50 or $3 and equalize. Either in the 2 other treatments, in the merit treatment, we manipulated the source of inequality. So the earnings determined not by who was most lucky, but the guy or girl who got the worker who received the $6 were the one who had been most productive on the assignment. So notice everything is the same in terms of the actual distributional situation. It's one has $6, the other nothing. The only difference is in how the inequality came about, the source of inequality. In the efficiency treatment, it's identical to the luck treatment. The only difference is that now there is a cost, an iceberg cost of transferring. So for each dollar you transfer, $1 is lost. So if you want to equalize, instead of ending up with 3.3, you end up with 2.2. So essentially, it's a very simple way of capturing the idea that there is a cost to transferring the money. So just to highlight a couple of important things. So we had a real choice. The decisions made by the spectator was matched with a unique pair of workers. it was the same pre-redistribution earnings in all situations. All spectators faced the 6-0 PPP adjusted for each country. And the spectators had complete information in the sense that they were informed about the source of inequalities. So there was no uncertainty about how the inequality came about, we told them, and also full information about the cost of redistribution. So, and this is going to be important because we essentially don't want to elicit preferences, not beliefs. So you want to fix beliefs. That was the key idea. Okay, just to a very short kind of theoretical framework to put you in our frame of mind. So essentially, the type of social preference model that we're going to have in the back of our minds when we interpret the results is that the spectators, they decide essentially to a distribution. 1 minus y and y, where y is the share income to the worker with no redistribution earnings. And we assume that essentially that the spectators, they care. So notice they don't have any self-interest in this decision, but we believe they care about the morality of this, right? So they dislike deviations from what they consider to be fair. So if y is different from m, which is what they consider to be fair, that this person with no pre-redistribution earnings get, they dislike that. And they also dislike if there is a cost of redistribution, they dislike that efficiency loss. And essentially what we assume here is that there could be heterogeneity along 2 dimensions. People could have a different idea what is fair, the m, and people could have a bit different weight on fairness relative to efficiency. So that's the basic idea we have in mind. Clearly, in the luck and the merit treatment, given our assumptions, people will simply implement what they consider the fair thing. So that's the beauty, of course, of the spectator design, is that we don't need to kind of filter out self-interest because there is no self-interest here, so they can just simply do what they consider to be the fair thing. In the efficiency treatment, essentially we assume that they would have done exactly what they consider the fair thing to do is what they would have done in the luck treatment, but how much they give will transfer depend on the relative weight they give to fairness. And if the weight goes to 0, essentially they transfer nothing in this treatment, and if it goes to infinity, they implement exactly what they consider to be fair. Okay, final little thing about the framework. In this super simplified setting, we assume that there are 2 fairness ideals. The egalitarian fairness ideal would say that all inequalities, both the inequalities due to luck and inequality due to merit or performance, are unfair. On the other extreme, you have the libertarian view, which is say that any inequality is okay, both those due to luck and those due to merit. And then you have the meritocratic position that would say differentiate between these 2 sources of inequality and say, well, I think inequalities due to luck are unfair, but inequalities due to performance, they should be accepted. So that's the setup. Okay. We asked questions about beliefs, and they were this type. So essentially, in your country, one of the main reasons for the rich being richer than the poor is that the rich have had, and then we varied, of course, the source. So we asked, for example, more luck in life, or that the rich have worked harder in life, or had greater innate abilities. So we think about the first question is to the extent to which you believe that luck is important, and the extent to which you believe that merit is important. It depends on to what extent you believe that hard work and innate abilities are important reasons why the rich are richer. And then we ask them about their beliefs in the cost of redistribution. And that's a hard question to ask. But what we used was this question: in your country, if the government increases the taxes that the rich have to pay, the rich will work less and invest less. So essentially trying to capture the incentive cost and idea that if you try to transfer, people are going to work less and invest less. And then finally, we asked everyone questions about to what extent they believe that the economic inequalities in their countries are unfair, and to what extent they agree that the government should aim to redistribute the economic differences between the rich and the poor in their country. So that's the essentially the setup. Yeah, so just scream out if there are some specific questions about the design. That I went through this super fast because now we have a lot of results also. But yeah, if not, let's move on to the results. Okay, so the results for the preferences, and the way we kind of summarize this is that we look at the inequality implemented by the spectator in each decision. So what I'm going to report mostly is going to be the average implemented inequality by the spectators. Essentially, we're measuring the Gini in each situation. That's what we're measuring, which then, of course, is measured then from 0 to 1. So if you left the inequality unchanged, the Gini would be 1, and if you equalize, the Gini would be 0. Simple as that. Okay, this is the first main result. So what I'm reporting here is the implemented Gini on average in each of the 60 countries. And okay, the first thing we notice is crazy variation, right? So remember, we put everyone, all these in all countries, they were faced with the same set of situations. So if there were no differences in people's fairness use, we would expect there to be people to implement on average the same inequality. That's certainly not the case. In countries like, again, you take Norway, which is one of the most implements least inequality in this across the different treatments. This is across all treatments. The implemented Gini is close to 0.2 or something, and it goes up to 0.75 in a country like China. So an enormous differences, even faced with the same situation in a controlled setting. So that's one of the first thing to notice. We're going to dig deeper into this, of course. The other thing is that there is huge differences across treatments. So if you look at just the implemented inequality in the luck treatment, when the source of inequality was luck, on average, the implemented inequality is across all countries and all individuals is 0.45. If you then only change the source of inequality, but leave everything else the same, it jumps up to 0.72. So an enormous difference that only is related to essentially the history of the inequality. So across the world, people really seem to care about the source of inequality. If you then look separately at each country, this is implemented inequality in the luck treatment. Again, you see the same thing, enormous variation, but fairly deep color, deep colors, which this is the heat map. So the light colors, the yellow colors are the more heat there is. So take the extreme example. I think Norway was the country with the lowest level of implemented inequality. It's like 0.08, and it goes up to something like 0.75 in China. So an enormous difference in this luck treatment. And now see what happens, right? Now I'm shifting between luck and merit. The map, the color of the map is changing dramatically. So in all countries, it looks like people are more willing to accept inequality due to merit rather than inequalities due to luck. Here we have just listed the countries. So this gives essentially the same information as the map. It's just easier to read. So you see that China, Vietnam, India, Uganda, countries that to a very large extent accept inequalities due to luck, while countries like Norway, Canada, and then the Netherlands, to a very little extent, accept that. And as we see, enormous variation. If you then look at the merit treatment, there is a shift upwards. And I'll come back to that for the country. We estimate it at the country level, the treatment effect, but we see the shift upwards. And you'll also see that there is a difference in the ranking. I'll come back to that. If you now compare luck with the efficiency treatment. So remember when I compared luck and merit, the only difference was in the source of inequality was due to, the difference was in the source of inequality, merit rather than luck. In the efficiency treatment, it's just like the luck treatment with respect to the source of inequality, but this time we have increased the cost of redistribution, so that's a 50% efficiency loss. What happens then with people's willingness to equalize? It goes up, but much less. So people are more willing to accept inequality when there is an efficiency cost of redistribution, but clearly the effect is much smaller than changing the source of inequality. I'll come back to this point. I mean, it clearly suggests that people care more about fairness than efficiency, essentially, across the world. And here you see the same type of map. This was the map to the luck, inequality and luck, and you see that when I switch, there is a change in the color, but the switch is much less. And here is the ranking. I will not spend much time on this. We also can put this in a regression framework. If you look at the preferences, the inequality implemented Gini, you see the huge effect, the treatment effect going from the luck treatment to the merit is 0.259, and it's 0.051 for efficiency. So super strong differences, even when we control for education, income, gender, all these different things. Okay, this is, I think, one of the most striking results from the project. And that essentially reports and I'll come back to this as well when we look at differences between countries towards the end. But essentially it shows the treatment effect for each country. So the difference in inequality acceptance due to luck and merit. And what we notice here is that some countries like Canada, Australia, Portugal, Norway, Netherlands, Italy, and several others, of course, countries we recognize, they really care about the source of inequality. Much, much more willing to accept inequality due to merit rather than due to luck. But there are also countries like India and China, Bangladesh, where that matters very little, almost exactly the same. And just think about how different countries are like that. Those are very different societies in terms of inequality acceptance. We see also some variation when it comes to the treatment effect of efficiency, but as I said, the levels are much lower. Okay, what we can do with this, and I can't really do this fully justice. This is one of my favorite figures actually, but it's what does it show? So essentially we can use the data to estimate at the population level the share of egalitarians, the share of libertarians, and the share of meritocrats in each country. And what we've done in this figure is essentially to rank countries according to the fraction of meritocrats in that country. Essentially, it really corresponds to the treatment effect that we saw earlier. That's what really defines the share of meritocrats. And what you see here is that countries like, as I said, Canada, Australia, Norway, Italy, have a very high fraction of meritocrats, very few libertarians who accept all inequalities, and also actually quite few, not that many strict egalitarians. Well, countries with very small fractions of meritocrats like India, China, and Bangladesh, they will have a correspondingly very high fraction of libertarians. So essentially, this is one of the products outcomes of the studies that we essentially can map fairness views in different countries and the prevalence of different fairness views across the world. Okay, beliefs, we can do similar type of analysis. So we looked at the difference essentially in the fairness of luck versus merit, and we can also look at the difference in the importance of merit versus luck. Remember now I define merit. Beliefs in merit is that the belief that, well, just I can talk on this slide. What this report is, reports the mean belief that the rich are richer than the poor because they have more luck in life across the world. And then the question is, do people, so we saw that people found merit more fair than luck as a source of inequality. What do people think is most important? Luck. So what I report here as the merit is actually the average of two questions. It's the question about to what extent they believe that hard work is important, the reason why the rich are richer than the poor, and innate abilities. It's robust to, you have actually several questions, and it's robust to alternative definitions of what we mean by merit. So people don't think that the fair source of inequality is the most important one. That's at the global level. Here is a similar type of map showing essentially the belief in luck. So which countries do believe more or less in luck, and which countries believe more or less in merit. And as I said, the darker color essentially then means that in you switch, that people believe less in merit than in luck. And this is a map essentially showing the belief that there is a large efficiency cost of redistribution. What we can do here, and I have to be quick, but I'll try to. So if you look at what's most, the merit indicator here essentially just reports the difference in the average belief in that luck is important and merit is important. And what is interesting, maybe, and I'll come back to the within person part of this, and the importance of income, rank, and education for your beliefs and also for your preferences. So this is the same type of analysis that we had for preferences, just with respect to beliefs. So this shows the difference in beliefs in merit luck. And as I said, in almost all countries, merit is seen as less important than luck. Okay, so this is what we, this is the main take-home message here from this part. Okay, policy attitudes. And I'll just say a little bit about how we think about the relationship between preferences, beliefs, and policy attitudes. So the extent to which you find inequalities in your society unfair is likely to affect your support for redistribution, right? And I'll document it. So that's one thing we can look at. We can look at to what extent is there a correlation between the extent to which people find inequalities in their society fair and their support for redistribution. And then, of course, if that seems to be important, we want to understand what is it that determines people's whether or not people think that inequality in their society is fair or unfair. And in particular, what we want to look at then is how does fairness, preferences, and beliefs affect the extent to which you find inequality in your society unfair. This, of course, takes away tons of other super important things that is likely to affect support for redistribution. Selfishness, clearly. You might have a self-interest in certain redistributive policies. Your trust in government is clearly going to be important, but you're focusing on fairness, preferences, and beliefs. So just take the first part of this, namely the link between your attitude towards or your view on the fairness of existing inequality in your society and attitudes towards government redistribution, and what you find is a very strong, maybe not surprising, this is, you can do this at the individual level as well, this is for at the country level, that in countries where people believe on average that inequality is very unfair, it's also very high support for, for government redistribution, and vice versa. Not surprising, but then of course that means, okay, so now we want to understand what is it that determines attitudes towards or views on the unfairness of existing inequalities. And this table essentially reports this. So the first three columns looks at how the answer to the question, do you consider inequality in your society unfair? Well, that depends on the behavior in the experiment, the actual implemented inequality in each of the three treatments. And what we see is that, as you expected, people who do not if you implement very little inequality in the experiment, you tend to believe that inequality in your society is unfair. And this is particularly strong in the luck treatment, and even more so in the efficiency treatment. So if you are very unwilling to accept inequality in the efficiency treatment, that is very strongly correlated with attitudes to the view that inequality in society is unfair. And then we could do the same with beliefs for each of the, and then we look at belief separately in that the belief that luck is important, merit is important, and the efficiency beliefs. And maybe not surprising, if you believe that luck is very important, you tend to believe that inequality is unfair. If you believe that merit is very important, you tend to believe less in that. And if you believe that efficiency, there's a high inefficiency cause of redistribution, you also tend to believe that society is more unfair, which also makes sense. Okay, so that was, I just need to make sure that I get through in time, so we have time for some discussion. So this was the kind of overview, just of the main results. What I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or something, so we have some time at the end, is to say something about within country variations and between country variation in these answers. So, and what I'm going to focus on first here, the within country variation, is on three pre-specified dimensions. So we posted a pre-plan. I didn't say that, but we had a pre-plan for this study. It's a hard project to write a pre-plan for, since it because of the amount of data. But we pre-specified three dimensions where we wanted to look at within country variations, income, education, and gender. And what we particularly had in our mind was the possibility that people may have self-serving fairness preferences and beliefs, with the rich being more meritocratic than the poor. And such self-serving biases might be functional both for the rich and the poor, right? Preserving a view on inequality in society that is favorable for themselves. And then we didn't really have a strong idea exactly how gender might shape people's views, but clearly there could be different norms, experiences that could especially affect their views on the role of merit in society. Okay, so what do we find? What I'm reporting here in this figure is the interaction essentially between a dummy for income level and for the background characteristics and the treatment effect of merit luck. So what we see here, just to take the main takeaway immediately, for the preferences, we see that people with high income and high education tend to be more meritocratic. So this is in line with a self-serving bias hypothesis. We also see that men are somewhat more meritocratic than women, but income and education is much more important. So across the world, people with high income and high education tend to be more meritocratic. we see something for income. We see something similar for beliefs. You see that people with high incomes tend to believe that, relatively speaking, that merit is more important than luck. We don't see a strong effect for education or gender. So, So, but the main story, as I said, is I would say on preferences, and we, in some sense, seem to confirm a self-serving bias, or at least we see evidence that is consistent with a self-serving bias in fairness views. We also look at we do similar type of analysis for the efficiency treatment effect. We find no significant interaction effect with income or education. We do find that men are slightly more efficiency oriented than females. And we find on the beliefs that richer and more educated people believe that the efficiency cost is smaller and males that is larger. Okay, then to the between country variation. Just to remind you, so and we're going to start with this. If you look at the relationship between GDP per capita and the actual Gini, we saw, as we mentioned earlier, negative slope. So more richer countries tend to have less inequality than poorer countries. We can create exactly the same figure for our data sets. So what we do here in this panel is essentially to show the relationship between GDP per capita and the Gini in our experiment. And as you see, we replicate, in some sense, the exact same pattern, that the implemented Gini in our experiment is lower in the countries, in the rich countries. So I think this is interesting. What I think is much more interesting is that we can go beyond this. Because what we can do is that we can look at, but is this pattern the same independently of the source of inequality? And if you look at, so what I've done here is just simply to look at the relationship between income in a country and Gini in the experiment when you only look at the luck treatment. And you see what is even stronger here, that countries, the rich countries accept less inequality on average. However, if you look now only at the setting with merits, you find the opposite pattern. It's not as strong, but richer countries tend to be more willing to accept inequalities due to merits. So essentially what this means is that, and it goes back to what we talked about earlier, right? That richer countries tend to be more meritocratic. That's the bottom line. The meritocratic countries, they tend to accept one type of inequality, namely inequalities that reflect differences in merit, but not inequalities that reflect differences in luck. And then we can also look at efficiency and GDP. We don't see very strong relationship between GDP per capita and the efficiency equity trade-off. But we do see, and this was we're not quite sure what to expect here, but we see a strong negative relationship between the beliefs that if there are high efficiency costs and GDP per capita. This might, of course, simply reflect that the rich countries have a more efficient redistribution system. So these might be rational beliefs, of course, because these are very different societies. Okay, then getting closer to the end of this presentation, we can also now look at the relationship between essentially how country characteristics, we had talked about the GDP per capita, but also inequality in the country, how that affects inequality in the experiment. And essentially what this shows is that if you, and the controls we have here is the regional controls taken from that Gallup Walpole is using. When you control for regional effects, you have a significant correlation between the Gini in a country and the Gini in the experiment, meaning essentially that people who live in a country where inequality, where there is a lot of inequality, tend to be more willing to accept inequality themselves. We do this also separately for each of the three treatments, and we see that this pattern is particularly strong, as we would expect it in light of what we've seen in the luck and in the efficiency treatments. Okay, whew, I'm sorry to go through this so quickly, but it's I wanted to have some time for you guys to discuss towards the end. So just to wrap up, I presented in some sense two stories initially for why we might be willing to accept inequality. Okay, so clearly there are a lot of other stuff going on in determining inequality in the country than the will of the people. But to the extent people are willing to accept it, right? There could be there are two stories. It's the efficiency story and the fairness story. And maybe the most important take-home message from this is that the fairness story appears to be more important than the efficiency story. Merit considerations important in almost all countries. Efficiency costs of much smaller importance. But also important to note that there is a lot of variation in fairness preferences, not only in beliefs. And this is a little bit, for those of you who know the literature before we did it, so to speak, focused a lot on difference in beliefs. So some of the most famous papers in this field essentially have said everyone is a meritocrat. We dislike inequalities due to luck, and we like inequalities due to hard work and effort. The difference between Europe and US, for example, is only about the beliefs about what the sources are. And essentially what we're showing is that there are clearly differences in beliefs, so that those are important, but there are also a lot of variation in fairness preferences, and they are also very important. And people across the world tend to believe that luck is more important than merit in explaining inequality in society. And this is an important reason why they believe that existing inequalities are unfair. And we find that people across the world overwhelmingly, I didn't emphasize that by the way, but overwhelmingly people tend to believe that the existing inequality in their own society is unfair. And so, and then finally, comparing across countries, fairness preferences, we found that richer countries are much more meritocratic in their fairness preferences, but not more efficiency seeking. I think there's been a lot of focus recently on the limitations of the rare samples. If you only look at the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies. And our study in many ways confirms that. The rare countries are different from the non-rare, and it's important, of course, then to look at also non-rare countries, but we also find a lot of similarities, I have to say. High income and educated people are more meritocratic across the world. So it's not like, so some things seem to be similar across the world. Richer countries believes less in merit causing the inequality, and in redistribution causing large efficiency costs. And finally, both fairness preferences and beliefs may contribute to explain why rich countries have less inequality than poor countries. Okay, that was, I've never managed to go through this presentation so quickly before. I hope it was possible to follow at least somewhere. And it leaves us 10 minutes for questions. I would love